Chapter 25. Then answered Bildad the Shuhite, and said, Dominion and fear are with him. He maketh peace in his high places. Is there any number of his army? And upon whom doth not his light arise? How then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less a man, that is a worm, and the Son of Man, which is a worm. Chapter 26. But Job answered and said, How hast thou helped him that is without power? How savest thou the arm that hath no strength? How hast thou counseled him that hath no wisdom? And how hast thou plentifully declared the thing as it is? To whom hast thou uttered words, and whose spirit came from thee? Dead things are formed from under the water, and the inhabitants thereof. Hell is naked before him, and destruction hath no covering. He stretched out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. He bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent under them. He holdeth back the face of his throne, and spreadeth his cloud upon it. He hath compassed the waters with bounds, until the day and night cometh to an end. The pillars of heaven tremble, and are astonished at his reproof. He divideth the sea with his power, and by his understanding he smiteth through the proud. By his spirit he hath garnished the heavens. His hand hath formed the crooked serpent. Lo, these are parts of his ways. But how little a portion is heard of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? I put chapters 25 and 26 together because they're both fairly short. Quite short, as a matter of fact. In chapter 25, Bildad the Shuhite, one of Job's friends, basically compares humans to worms. And which thing is not true. Even in an allegorical part of it, he said, Is there any number of his, upon whom doth not his light arise? Okay. Then verse 4 in chapter 25. How then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. Basically what this Bildad fellow is saying is that everything that God looks on is corrupt, and that isn't so. All human beings are the workmanship of God's hands. We are all his spirit children who have come here and gotten earthly bodies, and we are not worms, and he doesn't look on us as worms. And so in chapter 26, Job feels impressed to answer, and he asks him some questions. And basically, he asks in verse 2, How hast thou helped him that is without power? In other words, what good are you to somebody who is relying on you for help? How savest thou the arm that has no strength? Where is the strength that you are giving to those people who have lost it all? How hast thou counseled him that hath no wisdom? You know, where are you getting all of this information from? Because, and how hast thou plentifully declared the thing as it is? Where are you getting all of your information from? Because it's all wrong. He says in verse 4, To whom hast thou uttered words, and whose spirit came from thee? In other words, was this from Heavenly Father, or was this from Satan, or was this just something you decided to think of? Because this isn't from Heavenly Father. Heavenly Father doesn't talk like that. He doesn't think like that about his children. He said, in verse 7, He stretches out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. He's talking about the power of God here. This is Job talking about the power of God, doing it in ways of images. He's not suggesting that there are pillars of heaven. Okay, he's not suggesting any of these sorts of things as real facts. They are used as images of power. Verse 14, though these are parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? In other words, we have all of these witnesses all around him, all around us, of the power of God. And how much attention do we pay to them? How much do we really understand of what God can do for us? And in a sense, he's asking the rhetorical question of his friends, how much of what you're saying do you really understand? I hear the words coming out of your mouth, but I don't hear any wisdom coming out of there. I don't hear any of the judgments of God. I don't hear any of the love of God. I don't hear any of the counsel that would come from a wise man who understood God and understood me. This is what Job is telling to his friends.